they're never going to build a museum that tells you everything that MGH wasn't on the cutting edge of. It's like only going to be the things they did wrong, right?
Germ attack, I must fight back. I must fight back. Germ attack.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Germ Attack, where we talk all things health and space. We're your hosts, Winston and Jake.
Alright, this week we'll be going to Boston to delve into its medical history and how it has been a nexus for medical innovation for the past 3 centuries.
Germ attack.
Boston is the home of the Massachusetts General Hospital, which is situated in the city's West End. Founded in 1811, it is the oldest general hospital in the United States, and also currently ranked number 1 general hospital in the United States. To explain more about the activities of the MGH, here's Tegan Kehoe, the exhibit and education specialist of the hospital's Museum of Medical History and Innovation.
General hospital to mean a couple of things. One, we did have some other very specialized hospitals, such as a military hospital, but that was really not available for the general public. And two, it was a hospital that was available to all social classes.
Okay, so should we first talk about the hospital itself? How do people view it?
Yes, we shall. Well, the 19th century hospital had quite a lot of negative connotations in society, which was predominantly due to fear of the space in the hospital and the practice of the doctors because they were prepared to experiment on their patients. Moreover, the medical practice was still approached with trepidation because there are a lot of elements still kind of unknown and yet to be explored. However, immense medical breakthroughs in surgery in particular was made at the MGH, where the first ever public demonstration of an anaesthetic surgery was conducted at the MGH's Etherdome, the hospital's first operating theatre.
Let's take us back to the 16th of October 1846, where surgeon John Collins Warren and anaesthesiologist William Moulton were about to conduct surgery to remove a tumour on the neck of patient Edward Abbott.
Good afternoon, gentlemen, and welcome. We have gathered you here today following last year's failed attempt to showcase the first medical use of our new invention, Letheon.
Ridiculous.
Humbug!
Lies!
Now, gentlemen, I assure you this is no lie. Mr. Morden is running late, probably with another patient, or scared at the sight of blood. Ah, Mr. Morden, you have arrived. Your patient is ready for you.
Gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. I see our patient, Mr. Abbott, is strapped down and ready for the operation. Good. Now let us proceed. Now, Dr. Warren, your patient is ready for you.
Gentlemen, as you can see, this is no humbug.
America! So during this surgery, however, the germ theory wasn't really taken into consideration, as medical practice was unaware of exactly how diseases were spread.
The germ theory of disease states that some diseases are caused by microorganisms. These small organisms cannot be seen without magnification, and its growth and reproduction within their hosts cause that disease.
So I think we have a clip of you here, Winston, don't we? Describing an early Etherdome operation we reenacted earlier.
Yes, shall we listen to that now?
I think we shall.
So the image in question depicts the actual Etherdome surgery conducted in 1846, where you can see John Collins Warren cutting through the tumour of patient Edward Abbott. You can see Moulton there holding the anaesthetic device as he's administering the anaesthetic to Abbott. And as you can see here, this clearly shows kind of the lack of germ theory kind of prevalence in the 19th century. As you can see, all the men were wearing gloves, were not wearing gloves at the Etherdome as they were conducting the surgery. You can see Warren holding the scalpel trying to cut the tumour open, and he's literally no gloves at all, so it shows the lack of sterilisation. The men holding the blood and the handkerchiefs, no gloves at all either, so lack of sterilisation as well here. And also, what's interesting to note is that all the men present at the Etherdome were all wearing suits. And this is kind of different to what we see medicine today. In terms of everyone's in lab coats, everyone's quite sterile, everyone's quite, clinical. So it just kind of shows how much medicine has changed, as now if a doctor would see that image in terms of if that was something they'd see a surgery being conducted by, that'd be an absolute nightmare for doctors. But then, you know, it was revolutionary. Everyone was wooing and ahhing about how doctors were immensely capable and amazing in terms of they've completed this anaesthetic surgery. So that just shows how much medicine has changed over time in Boston here.
God, that's so interesting. I felt like I was there for a moment. So, how did that affect the hospital then?
Well, it completely revolutionised hygiene and sterilisation, Jake. And as a testament to this, let's hear Ryan explain Lister's carbolic acid spray, which kind of revolutionised the antiseptic use in hospitals.
British surgeon and antiseptic medicine pioneer Joseph Lister began experimenting with carbolic acid in 1865, publishing his findings in 1867. Atomizers like the one adjacent would spray acid into surgical field on the physician and patient over surgical instruments and directly onto the post-operative bandages. This successful first venture into controlling surgical infection came too late for the Confederate and Union soldiers of the United States Civil War. Amputation was seen as one of the only viable techniques to control spreading infections.
Germ, 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 germ attack.
In the 19th century, hospitals were seen as kind of a last resort for people, especially by the lower class of Boston. This was primarily due to the dangers of unsanitary conditions that hospital provided, so it was kind of understandable that people didn't really want to go. And kind of the thinking behind this was that diseases were carried through bad air and water, and this was known as miasma theory. To treat this, the aim of the hospital was to make wards more homey and to get what they considered good air in. So now we're going to talk about a soundbite that Alex will provide, as he was shown a comparison of the MGH hospital wards in 1897 and 1930.
In the first image, we can see what looks like a sort of domesticated hospital ward. There's a lot of plants, lots of paintings, and large windows. This ties into the theory of miasma. Overall, it seems like the aim is to make the hospital a less scary place. In contrast, the photo from 1930 shows major advancements in sterilisation. There seems to be less objects in the room, windows are a less prominent feature, and the beds are more spaced apart. The nurses and doctors, if we look at them, are now in lab coats rather than wearing suits and not very sterile clothes. We can see that the profession of doctors themselves has actually changed, with status being proved not by their dress but by their profession.
Wow, that was incredible stuff there from Alex. So, well, Jake, how about for kind of the different classes? Were there kind of connotations for that?
Yes, there were, in fact, Winston. The treatment you received depended on your social status. The MGH had a separate area called the Phillips House for the wealthy elite. This was to keep them away from the fear of the poor in the normal wards. This was intended to attract more Boston Brahmins into the hospitals. So the benefactors wouldn't give money to the hospital unless the Brahmin were treated well. Benefactors would state, services for the wealthy should be wholly of the luxuries. The pauper must have broiled quail and asparagus tips for dinner, and he need not have a private room.
Oh my goodness.
This still exists today, for certain patients such as royalty and foreign dignitaries, where the care still includes features of therapeutic environments.
Wow, Jake, you're really catching on here, aren't you?
Well, I am a quick learner, Winston.
Germ attack.
So did anything else happen in the hospital during this transition period of appearance of wards?
Well, they did actually. Well, kind of parallel to the changing domesticity of Boston's hospital wards, the practice of nursing was really changing a lot. And this was by the influence of a little-known figure. You may have heard of her, Jake. Her name is Florence Nightingale.
Yeah, I know her. Yeah. How's it go?
This was kind of principally due to the kind of their importation of her nursing style and methods into the MGH, through her students becoming leaders at the hospital.
So what was it like before that?
Well, let's let Tegan explain that.
You know, in the very early days of the hospital, it was, as you said, kind of relatives of people. It wasn't a professionalized thing. And then by sort of the mid-19th century, they did have people who were hired as nurses, but they weren't considered professional staff. They were doing many of the jobs that were more custodial. They were preparing food, they were doing the dishes, they were changing bedclothes, they were, doing the laundry, all of those things, which themselves can be skilled work, but not the skill that nurses are supposed to have.
Okay, well, what happened next?
Well, in light of Nightingale's methods and other forward-thinking individuals, such as Bart's,
QM represent!
yeah, the Massachusetts General Hospital then established its School of Nursing in 1871, granting diplomas in nursing.
So this essentially professionalised nurses?
Yes, indeed, and it was a huge catalyst for the breakthroughs in evidence-based nursing, and the World Wars during the time kind of created a space in which the field of nursing could be practiced, especially in World War One, where the MGH was one of several American hospitals which was based in the Western Front, and especially in France they had quite a few actually.
But as Tegan said, weren't the nurses relatives of patients? So what implications did this have on the patient's trust towards their individualised care?
Funny thing you should say that, Jake. We actually asked Tegan this exactly.
I think that it was recognizing nurses as people, professionals, as people that you would be entrusting a stranger the same way that you entrust your care to a doctor.
So the accepting of women in hospital workspaces in Boston has immensely benefited the field.
And it has, absolutely. And although the MGH no longer has a kind of school of nursing, it closed in 1981, the hospital still kind of prides itself in an exceptional standard of nursing. And this includes kind of the key to recovery is not only based on science and technology, but also human compassion and patient-centered advocacy. And as a testament to this, the MGH's social service department, whereby workers take a kind of holistic approach to prioritise patient welfare, has really kind of upped the standing of patients in the hospital over the past 100 years.
Germ Attack.
To give us something to take away from this week's Germ Attack, we have to delve into our critical turn. We do this every week. This is where we kind of contemplate and consider representations of reality and assess whether we should believe it and whether it's necessarily true or not. So for this week's Germ Attack, we discussed the theme of Boston's medical history. And we have to remember the ways in which institutions represent themselves and in which they're not accurately represented in the annals of history. So, everyone wants to be the bee's knees in history. Everyone wants to go down in history as we know it. And, after all, institutions like the MGH, they have the power to kind of control their certain aspects of their medical history to their certain advantage to make them seem better. So, for example, they may claim that they were the inventors of ether. So we talked about the anaesthetic, but we know, Jake, we heard about a man who was who practiced anaesthesia 50 years earlier. This man was in Georgia, and, he didn't go down in history. So, in reality, overall, ultimately, we have to know that history is more complex and more contested than what is actually portrayed. And this is perfectly kind of encapsulated by the soundbite we heard at the beginning of this podcast by Dominic Ward, the curator of the museum at the Harvard Medical School, who said that the MGH would never build a museum that would display things that they weren't on the cutting edge of, that they weren't at the forefront of in terms of medical research. So this is the takeaway we want you to bring from our critical turn in this Germ Attack podcast today, is that realities of history are not accurately represented because it is in the best interest of institutions to portray themselves in present-day society as the best they can be. So that was our critical turn today. Thank you for listening.
Germ Attack.
Let's talk to you, Jake. What have you learned today?
Well, Winston, what I've learnt today is how the germ theory has transformed hospitals from a dangerous place to where people went to get better, albeit over a lengthy period of time. As we can see, hospital wards themselves changed to reflect this, transforming the spaces from reflecting and replicating the domestic sphere to the clinical and sanitary and professional spaces we see today. We've seen how Boston has been at the forefront of medical advancement, which MGH and Harvard are both clearly very proud of.
Yeah, that's really good actually. We discussed that. And what else has changed over time?
Yeah, so at the same time as all this was occurring, nurses were becoming an increasingly integral and professional body within the medical institutions, taking on specialised roles in the hospitals that they previously found barriers to.
Yeah.
Trust wasn't lost here because the nurses came to represent and embody both the empowerment and the resources to make critical decisions about the patient's welfare, gaining respect and transforming the role of nurses into a middle-class occupation.
Absolutely, and that's happened over the past, 200
Yeah,
years? 200 years? So, Boston clearly prides itself on its innovation and fundamental role in medical advancements. And this exists regardless of how we measure both institutions and or separate contributions. It still happened in history. The ether dome happened, everything's happened in history.
Germ Attack.
Okay, great. So that's all for today, guys.
Yeah,
Thanks for
gone so
listening. Join us next week where we'll be looking at the recent and secret outbreak and its impact. And remember, stay clean.
This podcast was created and brought to you by the team at Germ Attack: Winston, Jake, Alex, Kieran, Harry, Megan, Caitlin, Ryan and Tonya. With special thanks to Tegan Kehoe, Dominic Hall and Jack Hadcock for their time and expertise. And of course with thanks to Kristen Hussey for being a 100% Hun all the time.
Attack. Germ attack. I must fight back. I must fight back. Germ, 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 germ. Germ attack.